What's up, guys? Welcome into Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, episode 35 of the podcast. I'm your host, Stephen MacDonald, and we finally made it. It's the championship game for the PLL Championship Series between the Chaos and the Whipsnakes. We're 19 games in with that one final one, the biggest one yet to go today at 12:30 Eastern on the NBC Sports family of networks. And I could sit here and talk to you guys about the game, break down the matchup between these two teams, and let you know who I think is going to win. But I want to do something that I think might actually be a little more important right now than doing that. And what I want to do is I want to say thank you to everyone who's watched and listened to the podcast over the past few months since I rebooted this thing back in May. And really, when I did that, I had no idea that we'd end up here today. I mean, when I rebooted this thing back in May, it was the day of the PLL Collegiate Draft. And that episode took about 3 whole days for me to prep for and actually be able to produce the content that we got from that episode. And then the PLL kind of offered an opportunity for content when we were in the middle of this pandemic and there was really no other sports content from which to work. And through that, we got things like the collegiate draft, we got the trade deadline, the waiver period, the roster announcements, the schedule releases, everything that went into building this PLL championship series, we covered at length here over the past few months on this podcast. And I've really had so much fun putting these shows together for all of you, and I've really enjoyed growing this thing, and I thank all of you so much for growing with me and this podcast over the last few months. And I've met some amazing people through rebooting this podcast and doing things like the Flow Fantasy Lacrosse League with all of you. And not only that, but I've also expanded the platforms that the podcast can be found on too, to include things like SoundCloud and Podchaser, which have started to kind of take its own form so far, and they've really started catching on, so I'm really pleased about that. And then from a content standpoint, I started doing things like the Skype shows with guests like Jordan Johnson and Phil Rothermick, and even getting a guy like Kevin Schreck on with Phil, who's another guy from our fantasy league, when we did that post-fantasy draft Skype episode just about a month ago now, following our PLL fantasy draft, which we had a lot of fun doing that as well. And I've also even had a PLL player's dad, I'm not going to specify who, but a PLL player's dad actually contacted Phil a few weeks ago and said that he loves the podcast and loves the content that I've been putting out here for all you guys. So I really appreciated that, and I had Phil pass along that message to him. But I've also had some people like one of my followers, Mark on Twitter, who retweets a lot of my episode posts and leaves very nice reviews of the episodes there on Twitter, so I appreciate that as well. And to everyone else who has interacted with me and my podcast over the past few months, I just want to say thank you, and I hope that you'll stick with me now that the PLL Championship Series has unfortunately had to come to an end. As of today, around 12:30, as I mentioned, is when that championship game will start. So really, what I want to do is talk about what's next moving forward for the podcast. I've been in talks to cover the NLL on the podcast when they get going later on this year in December, along with starting an NLL fantasy league. The platform for that is to be determined, but it'll probably be something like Flow Fantasy Inc. again, as they've started looking into possibly doing things with the MLL and NLL on the fantasy lacrosse front. But really, after today, the podcast will likely switch over to more football talk, at least for now, assuming they don't cancel their seasons for both the NFL and college. And I do have some guests lined up there, including a former Division I football player at Bowling Green. And then in December, as I mentioned, the podcast will switch back to pro lacrosse to cover the NLL season and kind of the fantasy lacrosse and everything that we've got planned for that as well. So my final note for all you guys is that if any of you have any ideas for how to improve this podcast going forward, please send them my way and I'd be happy to look into them. It could be anything platform related, as far as a site that I'm not on that would make it more accessible to all of you. It could be something content or format related, something that you guys think that I should cover that maybe I haven't yet and you'd like to get my thoughts on that, or anything else really. I'm open to considering anything that you've got, because this show is really for you and it's whatever you guys want me to do with it. I'll consider everything as I mentioned in order to make this a more enjoyable experience for all of you. So that'll do it for episode 35. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. Let me know who you think's going to win this championship game between the Chaos and the Whip Snakes. I know I didn't cover it on this episode, but I'd still love to get your thoughts on that. Also, as I mentioned here in this episode, let me know what you guys think that we should do with this podcast moving forward. And if you just have anything you'd like to say about the podcast, make sure to share that with me as well. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on it. But that'll do it for me. Thanks for listening.